Chambers versus Malone is a very confusing Cheers episode. Not insofar as it doesn't make sense, but definitely in the sense that I really don't know how I feel about this episode. It has one of the best moments ever, but the whole thing feels like a dream episode where I'm waiting for somebody to wake up and realize that everything that's happened is so ludicrous that it couldn't possibly be real. This is the 13th episode of the 5th season, directed by the wonderful James Burrows, and I think I might have thought that the first time I watched this episode. I don't fully remember how I responded to this. Of course, watching it now, I knew what was coming, but it does feel like one of those episodes where it just goes from one bizarre scenario to the next that it couldn't possibly be taken seriously. But then something happens that means that I can't help but love the fact that this episode exists. So there will be spoilers from now as I talk about what happens in this episode and share some thoughts along the way, but I will point out that my thoughts might be contradictory as I go through the various aspects, because there are some things that are really well done, there are some things that I struggle to take seriously, but as I said, ultimately it leaves me crying. I'll be honest, as I said, I knew what was coming, and even when it happened, I pretty much burst into tears because it felt like such a weight had been lifted, but we'll talk about that when we get there. It starts off quite interestingly, actually, with Sam offering to get some coffee for some guys in the bar, and they said, no, it's fine, we have a designated driver, and then they start to realise that actually that's not true. And this is interesting because I read something, and I can't remember where I read it, but there was some apprehension about setting a sitcom in a bar because there was this worry that it would glorify drinking, or that we just have episode after episode full of drunk people, and obviously this is not something that we get, at least not that often. And I like the fact that actually, at the very beginning of this episode, they were talking about designated drivers and responsible drinking, and they're actually using something that was a concern and turning it around to be a benefit and saying, well, we're set in a bar, let's highlight responsible drinking and designated driving. And I think that was a really great thing to do. The rest of the episode focuses pretty much on Sam and Diane, as the title suggests. Initially, Norm comes in and he talks about how something is missing in his life, something spiritual to give his life meaning. And then Diane comes in and she's singing. And whenever Diane enters Cheers singing, we know something bizarre is about to happen. She's usually in a good mood for a reason that makes no sense to anybody else. But interestingly, it makes sense to Carla. She's decided it's a glorious day because today is, and I quote, going to be the most special day of my life. And it turns out she woke up with a feeling that Sam would propose to her. And Sam is saying, no, that's not going to happen. And Carla tells Sam, don't ever make fun of a woman when she says she has a feeling about something. It's rare that we see Carla supporting anything Diane says. So I think that that's quite telling about Carla's position on premonitions and this kind of feelings. Sam obviously doesn't take this seriously. He has a bit of fun with it. He basically makes a mockery of Diane, or at least Diane's premonition, which is not nice to see, but at the same time I can understand if somebody said to me, today you're going to propose to me, I'd be very concerned that they'd be dictating to me that I'd be doing that. Tom then comes in, and it's been a while since we've seen Tom. I think he was in this season, a little bit earlier, but it has been a while, and he's getting the results from his last bar exam today, and then Sam is telling Diane he'll propose to her when there are snowflakes in hell and pigs will fly, and then Tom announces that he's now a lawyer. And of course, that seems impossible. So Diane just has this most glorious grin on her face because impossible things can happen. And then, much to Sam's credit, Sam's behaviour in this episode, in fact, Sam and Diane's behaviours in this episode are not great a lot of the time. But Sam in this moment I thought was very admirable. It's time to close the bar. He wants to have a private moment with Diane, and he tells her, even though she is giddy with excitement, he tells her he wanted this private moment to not embarrass her in front of everybody else. And he tells her to stop this nonsense. And honestly, I felt devastated for Diane because that has to hurt. And I'm kind of getting a little bit emotional thinking about this because, to be told, Diane is obviously so convinced that Sam will marry her and that she will live happily ever after with him. So for Sam to then sit down and tell her that it's never going to happen, it's going to hurt. It's going to be really brutal. And the change in Diane's expression is painful. And I feel like this episode really highlights times when Diane has a really unhealthy approach to certain situations. We've seen it before, usually before she has a breakdown of some kind. We definitely see it in this episode, and it is a prelude to some pretty unacceptable behaviour. Sam is brutal to her. She does cry, but I understand her response, and I will say I don't necessarily believe what Sam does next. He clutches onto her and asks her to marry him. I honestly I don't necessarily believe that that's how Sam would have responded. Of course it is, because that's what happens, but I feel like that was maybe a little bit too extreme. But nevertheless, it's what happens, and then as he clutches her and asks her to marry him, she says no. And we cut to Sam being walked to the electric chair, which is very bizarre, but it works very well. It's a very sudden shift. It's very shocking. It certainly is very dramatic, which I think is basically very fitting with the rest of this episode. Then it cuts back to Sam, and I love how he delivered this line, because he just says it so matter-of-factly. He says, "I just had a flash that I got the electric chair for killing you." It's not funny. It really isn't funny, but at the same time, it really helps to highlight just how baffling their relationship is. And then Diane points out Massachusetts doesn't have the death penalty. And then Sam gets a brief idea. And then Diane's face as she realises what Sam's thinking about. And he ends up chasing after her as she runs out of cheers. And the next thing we know, and this is the point when things just go from bizarre to unbelievable, really. And this is kind of when I started to feel like it felt like a dream. Like Sam was going to wake up in a cold sweat, and this is a nightmare that he'd been panicking about because Diane had said he was going to propose. And this has happened in previous Cheers episodes where a bizarre thing has happened and then we find out it's a dream, but not very often. But this definitely feels like it should have been, for the most part, one of those episodes. But as I said, there is something that happens in a little bit that made me cry. Genuinely, I knew it was coming and I still cried at it. And I will talk about that when we get there. It's actually in the last 10 seconds. But for now, Tom comes into Cheers and he reveals Sam is in jail. What? This is insane. Diane had him arrested for assault and battery. We cut to the courtroom. Sam declares he never touched her, which I think was important to establish that very quickly. Because for about 1 or 2 minutes at the most, it may not even be that long, we, the viewer, are led to believe that Sam, a character we very dearly love, has committed a really horrible act. And then we establish very quickly that actually this isn't the case. And Diane comes into the courtroom with a neck brace and a cane. It's very dramatic. I love the outfit she's wearing. I know that's irrelevant, but I really love it. And Diane, the bail is set, and Diane is asking if she can explain things. And the judge says, "Be brief." And just the look on Sam's face, because we know Diane is not capable of being brief. And Diane tells the story of their relationship to the judge, refers to Sam as the little Dickens, which is very cute. And the judge says, "I was just trying to imagine the long version of this story." And we ultimately learn that Sam was chasing Diane and she tripped and fell. And that's how she got her apparent injuries. I say apparent because they're not real. And I feel like at that point, admitting in court that he didn't touch her should have been the end of it. It should have been the end of it. But things get a little bit more strange. And Tom suggests that Sam proposes again so that Diane will drop the charges, which kind of seems like bribery. So there are a lot of things in this that are a bit unbelievable, but nevertheless, this is what happens. And Sam says, just to reinforce how strange things are, he says, and I quote, "You mean I have to propose to her to keep her from going to jail, where I wouldn't be going in the first place if she'd said yes to any one of my 3 proposals?" Pretty much sums it up. He proposes. She says okay. Everybody else leaves the court. She takes off the neck brace and folds up the cane. And to Diane's credit, and it is very hard to find anything positive about Diane's behaviour in this episode. But to her credit, she does say to Sam, I'm sorry I got a little carried away. Understatement of the century. And she says she's not going to hold him to this proposal. And then she's about to walk out, and this is the bit. When I say it's the last 10 seconds, I'm not even joking. I watched it 3 times and obviously timed it, and it is literally the last 10 seconds. Sam stops her from leaving and says that she's not going to get away with this. And he says, they can stop me from killing you, but they can't stop me from marrying you. We've been waiting so long for this. It just feels like this tremendous weight has been lifted for so long. I have wanted to shake the pair of them and just tell them to get on with it. Mostly Sam with his in denial, but also Diane's not exactly behaved admirably with a lot of this. But just those final words, those final 10 seconds of this episode are so powerful. It feels like it could be a season finale. I'm glad it's not. I'm thrilled we have a lot more of season 5 left, but it's so powerful and so moving. And as I said, I cried. It's when you've waited so long for something to happen and then it happens, even if the journey is ludicrous, it is so beautiful. And just that hug, that embrace between the two of them is just so magical. And the fact that they were alone as well, had that moment happened in the courtroom surrounded by everybody else, it might not have been as magical, as perfect, but because they were alone, just Sam and Diane both finally admitting at the same time how they feel about each other. It's wonderful. So 99.9% of this episode is so strange and unbelievable. But if that's what it took to get to those 10 seconds, I'll take it. I'll accept it. If nothing else, it's a memorable episode. And obviously a very emotional one as well, because it feels like this has been a very long time coming. And even though I knew how this ended, it got me. It really got to me, and it is such a joy. But I will say no more about what happens with their relationship or what's happening going forward. As I said, we do have quite a journey left of season 5. Chambers versus Malone may be one of the strangest episodes. We may have some behaviours from both characters that I don't completely love or believe in, but we have 10 of the most glorious seconds. And those 10 seconds make it all worth it. What a relationship, what a journey, and it's not over yet. More on that as we go through the rest of this season, but certainly Chambers versus Malone, if nothing else, is a very memorable episode.